Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Valerie Sanderson and I'm joined by Paul Moss, our Global Affairs reporter. And Paul, we have this extraordinary story of espionage and betrayal with a top Ukrainian official convicted of spying for Russia and sentenced to life imprisonment. What can you tell us about him?
Well, he was the head of counter-terrorism and counterintelligence at the SBU, that's the Ukrainian Security Service. And so he had huge responsibility, but it turned out, yes, he was working for Moscow all along. Now, because he was head of counterintelligence, one of the main things the Russians wanted to know is how much do they know about us, if you see what I mean. Now, that sounds rather convoluted, but such is the nature of someone who was effectively a double agent. But we know that he was also passing information on much more down-to-earth things, Ukrainian troop movements. The Russians also wanted to know how much damage is it doing when we hit particular sites, presumably so they could know whether they were worth striking again. And another thing that we know that this man was passing on to the Russians was details of other staff working at the SBU. Now, that's interesting because it suggests that maybe the Russians were thinking, well, if we can find people who are vulnerable, maybe other people will be open to offers from us to come and spy. All in all, it shows, though, that the Russians who are able to recruit someone very, very high up indeed, which will be of considerable concern to Ukraine.
And how did Ukraine catch him? They started this operation, didn't they, called Operation Rat? Operation
Rat, yeah, it's got a great name. They haven't given too much detail, but it seems that this involved the way in which this man, the colonel, was himself communicating with Russia. And they ended up finding a safe house with mobile phones, special mobile phones, and a special internet router that couldn't be detected. And that's how they caught them. But they've said this was an unprecedented operation, and you could see why. Can you imagine how difficult it must be? Because this was someone who was right at the top of the SBU, and the SBU had to investigate him without him finding out. And it was very important he didn't find out that he was being investigated, firstly because they wanted to catch him, but also because once they did work out he was indeed a spy, they did something very clever. The SBU didn't immediately arrest him. What they did was they fed him false information, which they knew would then go back to Russia, and the Russians would be using that false information. But eventually, of course, they did decide to move in. He was arrested more than a year ago, and his case is finally closed.
I mean, do you know why they suspected him? Because, as you said, he was at the very top.
We don't have that information. What we do know is that he was recruited a long time ago, back in 2018 in Vienna. We know that he was motivated by money. Cash was handed over, but basically the Russians, I suppose, kept him as what they call a sleeper. He wasn't really doing very much until the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They were obviously looking ahead, at which point he was activated and became very, very useful to him.
And this is not the first high-profile case, is it, in Ukraine?
The extent of Russian penetration is certainly going to be a worry. We know that there have been literally thousands of investigations into Ukrainians for spying, and we know that hundreds of them have been successful. And they vary. Obviously, in the east of the country, people are giving information on troop movements, very simple things like that. In the west of the country, people have been given information on things like installations, infrastructure, targets that the Russians might attack. And they vary enormously in the kinds of people involved and why they did it. Some, yes, for money. There are also people who seem to have been almost tricked, and an old Russian trick dating back to the Cold War, which was called the honey trap, using romantic seduction to get people. We know of one case where there was a 19-year-old daughter of a priest. She seems to have been charmed by a Russian handler, and what she was doing, she was going up to the second floor of her father's church and filming the Ukrainian troop movements, live streaming them to Russia. She was paid, but it seems that this was all done by charm. As I say, the extent of this really quite remarkable.
Is it always about money, or is it about ideology too?
I think we can certainly see cases where that's happened. I mean, older people, they will remember when Ukraine and Russia were in the same country, the Soviet Union. For them, this feels very much like a sort of a civil war. They will have had friends and former allies on the other side, and there's no way around it. Some of them have been sympathetic to Russia, sympathetic to the Russian cause, and certainly some of the people have given information to the Russians for that reason.
What does it tell us, do you think, Paul, about corruption in Ukraine? I mean, corruption is well documented, isn't it?
Indeed. I mean, in that respect, I don't think we should be too surprised that people have been bribed into spying for Russia. I mean, yes, it's a fact that corruption is very much a problem in Russia. We've seen high-level people in Ukraine found guilty of, for example, taking money that was supposed to go to the armed forces and using it for themselves, cases which have really horrified the public. So I guess if people can be bribed to do anything like that, to give jobs to people in order to get more money, then yes, they'll take bribes to spy for Russia.
It all sums up sort of images of what happened in the Cold War and the tradition of Russian spying, which is still going on.
Absolutely. I mean, these people, a lot of them were still around from the KGB days, and Russia was very well honed during the Cold War and had a lot of success in penetrating at a high level. And people with a long memory remember in Britain, we had this trio. They were called Philby, Burgess and Maclean, three people right at the top of the spying establishment in Britain who it turned out all along were spying for Russia. George Blake, Anthony Blunt, other names like this. In fact, it caused a major problem during the Cold War because it reached a point where the Americans, the CIA, didn't want to give information to Britain because they regarded it as leaking. But then America had problems of their own. There was a man called Aldrich Ames who actually died earlier this year. He was simply out for the money. He was a senior CIA man. He needed cash, and he walked into the Russian embassy in the United States and said, how much for information, and sold it at a level. And many people are thought to have suffered as a result.
Do we know about the extent of Russia spying on other countries now? Because obviously it must be different now in terms of the technology.
Technology has changed everything. I mean, first of all, in terms of recruitment, we know that some of these people in Ukraine are recruited over the internet through Telegram. They actually put out ads, give us our help and we will pay you. It can be done by cryptocurrency. We certainly know that the number of arrests for espionage have shot up. We don't know if that just means we're catching them. I mean, hundreds of diplomats in Europe have been returned to Russia, Russian diplomats, and many of them were, as the euphemism goes, guilty of activities incompatible with their status, which means spying. But there have been other cases, similar in fact to this colonel, where they were sleepers. I mean, there was the supposedly Brazilian academic who was arrested in Norway. He was actually a Russian. He'd been a supposedly Brazilian academic in Canada before. He was actually finding out lots of information about the polar region. Here in Britain, we saw a ring of Bulgarians arrested for allegedly spying for Russia. I mean, these people had also been in Britain for a very long time. So it's very possible that the activities have kept up, or it's possible it's been the same since the Cold War ended. It's just that we've started to notice and indeed started to care about it a bit more.
And what about the other way around? Because the West spies on Russia too, doesn't it?
Russia is, by some accounts, having a record number of arrests for espionage and treason. One group that monitors this said, in fact, this year has been a bumper year for Russia arresting people for espionage. They fall into
internally.
Yes, internally. They fall into different categories. You first of all got Russians who were arrested in Russia for espionage. Now, Russia is deeply, deeply worried about any kind of foreign interference. One allegation is if you simply accept help from a foreign organization, maybe a human rights group, you can get yourself arrested for espionage. But there have also been foreigners arrested in Russia. I mean, I think of people like Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal journalist. He was openly reporting. He wasn't hiding in Siberia, but he suddenly found himself arrested for espionage. His defenders would say he was simply used as a bargaining chip, and sure enough, he was later swapped. I should say another category is not within Russia itself, but within Russia-occupied Ukraine. Hundreds of people have been arrested there for espionage. Ukrainians who may well indeed have been very brave people feeding information back to their home country, Ukraine, about what the Russians are up to. And they've had very severe prison sentences for doing this.
And how important do you think spying is for the Russian state? I mean, I suppose what we should remember is the man at the top, Vladimir Putin, started off as a KGB spy, didn't he?
I think that's very important. So he's obviously going to take espionage as a crucial role for any country. I mean, certainly if people are able to deliver targets and tell people about foreign installations and what's important and what infrastructure is vulnerable, that has got to be useful to Russia. I think at the same time we should remember that one could argue that there has been one huge intelligence failure. When Vladimir Putin launched this invasion of Ukraine, he famously thought that the country would fold and the war would be over in a few weeks. Now, some people will tell you that that is because of bad intelligence about Ukraine's military vulnerability. But there were also people suggesting to the Russians, suggesting to the Kremlin, look, you have lots of supporters and sympathizers in Ukraine, in politics, in the military and civil society. When you invade, they will rise up in support of you. Well, that didn't happen, and the intelligence about Ukraine's military structures proved to be underestimating it, and that is perhaps why we had a war that was supposed to last a few weeks, and we're still going more than 4 years later.
Thanks, Paul. And that was Paul Moss, our Global Affairs reporter. If you want to find out more about this story, just listen to the Global News podcast. Click on the link below. But that's it from this edition of the Global News podcast here on YouTube. Thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and bye for now.